Are you ready to dive deep into places where you can get a massive edge over your opponents and make significant impact on your overall win rate? Monotone boards represent 5% of the total boards that you will get, yet are the most understudied and misplayed spot. Watch this video and learn how to get better and crush your opponents. Hello guys, how's it going? What's up? Welcome to another video. Today we're going to be talking about monotone boards, why it's really important to study them, and cash game heuristics. So let's head into it. So in this video, we're going to learn top to bottom what a universal framework for monotone boards would be. So for example, why they're important, flop heuristics, and how to use custom aggregated reports for SRPs, 3-bet pots, 4-bet pots, maybe some others. How to apply what you've learned from the flop reports directly into your game. Then we're going to learn turn reports. So meaning based on your equity and your overall range composition, how sizing and frequency will be affected. How ranges look like, right? The overall composition of the ranges and what each bet size does. So hand categories, EV denial, and in the end, a universal thinking framework for studying monotone boards and predicting by comparison so you don't have to study every freaking spot. So let's first talk about why it's really important to study monotone boards. First of all, they are 5% of the total boards in play. So 1 in every 20 times that you get a board is going to be monotone, right? Second of all, people don't really study them, which is great because edge is found where your opponents don't really study. So even if you put in 5 hours, you'll be ahead of more than 95% of opponents that you'll face at the table. If you're playing low stakes, then probably somewhere around 99.9. Second of all, it's really easy to stop leaking in the spot because most of the hand classes really dictate the action. Also, make sure that you don't invest something like 100 hours in this discipline because there's a law of diminishing returns, which really says that the more you invest into it, the less you get out. So somewhere a balance around 5 to 10 hours would be great. And if you see that your opponents are catching up, if you're playing probably like nosebleeds or something like that, maybe slightly more because you're really scrounging for edge at that point. But most of the time, you're just going to be fine. To determine flop heuristics for monotone boards, first of all, you're going to use custom aggregated reports to determine sizings. Then you're going to get bet sizes from each spot and make a sort of an average. Try to remember the general ideas. Remember the general ideas and the frequency, and then you go in depth with analysis. But if you figure out a spot where you're not really understanding it, don't dwell more than 15 minutes on it. Move on. We're going to get into an example right away, but what you should know is that there are 3 groups that we're going to focus on: ace high, Broadway high, and low high. Well, ace XX as a notation is ace high, BXX is Broadway, LXX is 9 high and lower boards. We're going to filter monotone boards by high card and get the stats, and in the end, it should look something like what's below this picture. So 3-bet pots in position, button versus UTG. Gen means general, X means check, check 30, B25 62, B50 7%. Ace XX, so ace high boards, check 32, B25 42%, B50 26%, right? And in the Broadway region and lower high card region, we haven't even written B50 because there's no B50. So if it's 0, don't write inefficient data. So now that we're in the custom reports region, let's select one that we've pre-made. So let's say 3-bet button versus UTG. We're going to look at it and go into filters right here. And we're going to select monotone. And then we're going to look at the boards. We're going to press check because this is not the player that we're interested in. And now we're going to look at the button 3-better. This is the total of 5.2% boards. Ace high, king high, we filter them by high cards, right? Now you can select ace high from the filter, right? But this will result in the same line as the board. But if you want to select broadways, you can select king, queen, jack, and 10 from the filter region, and then you will have an average right here. So you'll have check 20%, no B10, and bet 25 about 78% of the times. There are slight variations, but if you apply this median strategy, everything will be absolutely fine. If you want to look into the lower board region, you just select from 9 and lower, And then you will see the average right here. Make sure not to confound this with the UTG versus button. This is the general frequency for all the 1,755 boards. And this is your selection, your filtered frequency. So for 9 and lower, right? So LXX boards, you'll have 58% check, which you can route to 60, and 38% B25, which you can route to 40. This is slightly negligible. So to gather this data properly and really make it usable, you don't really go through all the spots. You go through 3 spots. You choose the tightest spot, which is, for example, in 3 button position, middle position versus early position, right? The loosest spot, which is button versus cutoff, blind versus blind, is something else. You're just going to treat that differently. And the average spot, which is exactly in the middle, cutoff versus MP. You try to simplify the strategy to one size per board type. So one on ace high, one on Broadway XX, and one on low high, and then compare the EV of the sizes, write down the results in Sheets. I use a Discord server, which then I transpose to Google Sheets. It's just a personal Discord server. You can just open a Discord server and use it. And then you're going to try to understand what each size does and why that size works as it does. All right, so now let's figure out how to execute a low bet size on flop, right? If you have a frequency of 80% plus, just bet range. Under 20%, check range. Otherwise, you're supposed to know the general frequency of the spot that you have from your aggregate reports that you've extracted, right? And then apply it to the board and the hand, right? So is ace king 7, for example, better for than ace 8 7 for UTG? Maybe not in a monotone situation. You look that up. 80% of hands will be really, really around the frequency. So if you don't know if your hand is better to bet or worse to bet, just bet it at frequency and you'll generally be fine. Generally, the idea is if your hand is strong or like a better bluff, deviate a little bit upwards towards more frequent betting. And if your hand is worse and it's like marginal value, has showdown, or is like a not a great bluff, deviate towards less frequent betting with that hand. All right, so afterwards, we're going to go to the turn. We're going to study turn reports and get a general idea on how equity derives frequency and bet size, but not how you might think it would be. We'll see in a second. Also, we're going to select one board for each type of board. So ace 8 5 mono for ace XX, king 10 6 mono for Broadway XX, and 7 6 deuce for low. So we're going to play adjacent boards, mostly how we play these boards. So you just have a general idea of the strategy. So let's look into one of the boards that we've selected. This is UTG single raise pot versus big blind on 7-6 deuce. On the flop, we're mostly betting at a high frequency with low size. And then on the turn, after we bet a small size, we can look at turn reports. So by clicking on the turn and then clicking on the reports button, you can see all the turns. And if you filter them by equity, then we're going to be able to see, for example, which turns are really good, which turns are really bad for UTG, so for the preflop raiser. We see that some of the low boards are really, really bad, and some of the high boards are very, very good. So they give us a lot more equity. Thus, let's select a few turns, but we can also see the size from here by clicking on strategy and clicking on check because you're interested mostly in the UTG's strategy. So if you click on big blind check, you will then see that on heart turns, so 4 card flush turns, and this is a general heuristic that I want you to remember very, very well, is that we are mostly using a very, very, very large size. So we're using one of the B175s. We're using an extremely large overbet. Why does this actually happen? You might think that maybe it's an equity advantage, but the answer is actually no. On these turns, we actually have the lowest equity possible. So why is that? Because we need to be a lot more polar when we have less equity, or actually not bet at all. But if we look at the ranges on a heart turn, so let's select, for example, the Jack of Hearts turn, after big blind checks, if we look at the ranges, we're going to see that we have really, really large advantage in the top equity bucket. So we have a very high advantage in nuts. And also our opponent has a lot of hands that he can pay us off with. So are not going to fold for that size. So that's why we employ only a really, really big size with only the top of our range and also some bluffs, obviously. So that's why we proceed on the turn like this. On other turns that we are really, really favored in from a point of equity. So let's say, for example, instead of the Jack of Hearts, we choose the King of Diamonds. We're going to see that our strategy ranges into a lot of small betting. So we're going to use still the really, really small bet sizes because we still have an advantage in equity, mostly across the spectrum, and we can force our opponent to polarize himself. This is really, really huge. So you might think, okay, if this card is very, very good for us, why are we still betting small? Why are we not trying to build a really, really big pot? Well, your opponent is also going to have his fair share of nuts. We aren't really that nut right now in the nut department. And he's gonna have to raise a lot of the top 80 to 100% quadrant. So he has to polarize himself. That means that on a brick river, by the way, so let's say on a 3 super brickish river, we actually have all-in sizing. So we actually have 7.5x bot. Why does this happen? This happens because on the turn, Big Blind is actually really forced to polarize with his top range and raise. So that leaves Big Blind without most of his top range, because otherwise he's actually risking playing a 12.5% pot with nut flush if he doesn't really raise our small bet on the turn. So that's why our small bet on the turn, our B33, our B50 work really, really well. They don't really hinder us from getting all the money in. They just force Big Blind to start raising his top range. Otherwise, he's going to play a very mediocre pot with, well, his top range, his second nut flush, and so on and so forth. All right, so we've now transcended to a 3-bet pot. Cutoff has 3-bet hijack, and hijack has called. The flop is 7-6 deuce, the same that we looked at before. Cutoff bets really, really small, and then hijack has called. Let's look at turn reports again. Looking at the turn reports for the spot, you can see again that the 4-card flush boards generate the very largest sizes, while other cards that favor more the cutoff's equity, like really, really high ones, will generate very small but more frequent sizes. And the board kind of plays the same as in single raise pots. The other guy is really forced to raise when you're betting small and very frequent, because otherwise he's going to play a really small pot compared to when he raises versus a very marginal sort of bluff catchy side of your range. We've now moved to a 4-bet pot where cutoff has 4-bet button, and we're looking at aggregate reports for the flop. You can see that actually the 10% size is being used quite a lot, actually on ace high board specifically, and king high and queen high. And why do you think that would actually happen? If you look at Button's calling range, it really, really contains a lot of king highs, some queen highs, some suited connectors, and it's very, very hard on a board like Ace 8-5, like the one that we chose earlier to study, to face a B10 from the cutoff. It's actually mostly using either B10 or B50. And if you have a hand like King Queen that doesn't really have any sort of backdoors, like King Jack of Spades, King 10 of Spades, Queen Jack, Jack 10, this B10 goes like a really, really, really long way. After B10 on the flop, if we look at the turn, again, I'm not sure if it's very, very visible, but I will click on B15. As you can see, the heart turns, the 4-card flush turns, are the ones that are generating the larger bet sizes. So this is a heuristic that is available and applicable across all monotone boards in general. So thank you so much for reaching the end of this video. Please leave a comment down below if you enjoyed it. And I hope this sparked your curiosity for monotone boards and spot where you can squeeze that extra little EV from your opponents that are not really studied at all. If you would like to dive deeper in the world of monotone board heuristics and cash games, there is a 1-hour coaching in the GTO Wizard library titled exactly like that I held. And I hope you enjoy it.